Hello, and welcome to the Lend Hoping Nothing podcast. I'm Michael Humphreys, and I'm happy to be talking to you today. This is episode 24, and today I want to talk about contracts as human acts. And the reason I want to talk about this and kind of work through it is that the way that we typically think about contracts is it's this kind of ethereal thing that exists apart from us, or maybe between us. And in a certain sense, it does, because there's a certain interaction and it involves a relation between different parties. But primarily and principally, it is a human act. And the way that I'm starting to think about this is I've been reading this book by Dr. James Gordley on the philosophical foundations of contract law, or the philosophical origins of contract law. And it's really interesting because he does draw that back to Aquinas in particular. And the late scholastics work this out in some more detail. And so there's a couple of interesting things that kind of go along with this. And part of what this does, it helps to clarify a few issues around usury and the mutuum and how different contracts are related to each other. And part of what's driving this is, an essay I'm working on to distinguish the difference between usury and just price or unjust price that I talked about in my American Maritime Association conference. And I think this way of doing it makes it very clear not only the difference between sales and loans, and then specifically mutua, but also given what the usurer actually wants. Because he ultimately, what the issue of justice with the mutuum comes down to, it, as I've been able to conceptualize it, is that it involves the restoration of what you gave, and that's it. And the potential way around that is to say, well, I don't want to be merely restored to what I gave. I want some profit as well. And so, I want to exchange my money or exchange something to receive a profit. And I don't want to, lend such that it's merely restored. So that's kind of the motivating factor. And I think that this ultimately points back towards fully collateralized or fully asset secured debt as implying the form of the contract given the end intended. So that's the background. Here's kind of where it's coming from. So Dr. Gordley, he explains that Aquinas takes the position that, contracts are human acts. And you can see this in the simple sale in particular, because what's going on there is that it really is just a natural act. So I give something to you so that you will give me something in return. And so that's a certain activity. It's just something that you do. There's no artificialness to it. And this type of activity pre-exists any sort of positive law. Any specific formulation of these type of contracts in positive law. And so Aquinas will, in his question on use or right, he'll discuss that there is a natural right to this type of exchange, to receive back as much as you gave in exchange. And so taking the simple sale as the example, you have this issue where it really is just this natural human act. And so if we first establish that contracts are human acts, perhaps then formalized in positive law and established with certain rules, then we can start working out a few things. So one of the things that Aquinas will do is that he notes that the species of a particular act is determined by its end. And so the difference between, I kind of like this example. It's kind of, I think, morbid, but it's the example that Stephen Long uses in his book, the Teleological Grammar of the Moral Act. And he talks about opening someone's chest open in order to do surgery. And his point there, though, is that the opening of the chest cavity is not per se immoral, because that act can be ordered to the further act of repairing the heart. And when you have the opening of the chest cavity ordered to the repairing of the heart, the species of the act is a medical act. So it's taken together as one act. So, and this is because in order to heal the heart, to do this medical intervention, it's necessary that you open the chest cavity to get access to the heart. And so there's a per se ordination between the act of opening the chest cavity and then the act of, whatever work you have to do on the heart to repair it or whatever. And so, but the end is the repairing of the heart. And so from that you get the specific nature of the act. Now, if you were merely opening the chest cavity, that the proximate end of that act is the death of the person. If there's nothing further, no further end you're pursuing by doing that, and so then that would be, that would fall under the species of murder. And so you can have different, even physically, the same act that is specifically different. Another one he gives is pushing a woman, which is another terrible example, but it's a good mode of writing because it really stays in your memory. And so you can have physically the same act, pushing a woman, but the species of the moral act can be different. So if you're pushing her out of the way of a bus, then that is a specifically different act than if you were pushing her into the way of a bus. And so you can have physically the same act that has two different moral species in virtue of the end. And so human acts, contracts or human acts, the species of the human act is determined by its end. So then, therefore, different species of contract are determined by their ends. And Aquinas works this out quite interestingly in question, the second part of the second part, question 61, I think it's Article 3. And so in the last paragraph, or the second to last paragraph, no, it's the last paragraph, about in the second half of that paragraph, he talks about voluntary commutations, because he's talking about the difference between distributive and commutative justice. And so he talks about voluntary commutations there. Before that, he talks about involuntary, like robbery and murder and so forth. But in the second half of that paragraph, he talks about voluntary commutations, and he specifically lays out various contracts. And he specifies them according to their ends. So the first one is if you wish to simply transfer your a thing to another person, then that is a sale. So your intention is to transfer it to another person in order to receive something back, I should say. Because another distinction that the late scholastics will make is that they'll bring gift into the contracts, but gift is not properly an act of commutative justice, but rather of liberality. And so, because there's that giving to someone freely for their own enrichment. And so then there you have the end. So you're giving it for the sake of someone else's, their enrichment. That end is what defines it as a gift. Whereas if you're giving it in order to receive something in return, that's a sale. And so then there you have, a different end, and so a different kind of contract. The next one he goes into, and he has, what was it? I think it's four different types. Is you are you're giving someone the use of a thing that at some time later they restore it back to you. And so he considers different examples. And so you give him something that it would be restored back either gratuitously, and in this case he gives the example of a usufruct, which is giving it gratuitously so that they might return it back, but it's something fruitful. And so you're not only giving them the use of it, but also the fruits. And so that they can have, in order that they might have the fruits. So there's a specific difference there. And then in unfruitful things, you have the mutuum and the commodatum. Now the commodatum is it's like a library loan, where, and here's the difference between these two, because there's more than one sort of use that you can give. You can give a use that consumes the thing, or a use that does not consume the thing. And so then there's a specific difference there in the type of use you're giving. But this is in things that do not bear fruit. And I'm kind of trying to think through this as well. Like what is maybe the because, for example, here that because he talks about it in terms of things that might not bear fruit. And I think it might be in terms of what kind of use you're granting. Because potentially you could grant, some sort of plant or like a tomato plant or something. But someone's going to use that, they're going to, what they need it for is to, crush it up and use it for fertilizer, or they need to destroy it in some way, even though it fructifies, it generates more than itself. I'm not entirely sure, if what that would mean. Because in the first case, you're giving them the use and the fruit. But in the latter case, you're not necessarily you're giving them just the use. And so you may not be giving them the fruit. So I'm still trying to work out the difference between granting fruit and granting the use of fruit. Because you could grant someone an apartment, or maybe a house even, that has a garden attached to it, but you're only granted the use of the property, so you can live there, but you're not granted the fruits of the apartment. So you're not granted the fruits of the garden, for example. And so there might be a case in there, but I got to work that out a little bit. Anyway, so a use that consumes the thing versus a use that does not consume the thing. And so that type of use that you're giving, which goes into the end, is going to distinguish between the mutuum and the commodatum. And then he considers a contract where you grant the use but for a price. And so this would be a lease or locatio. You could make a further distinction in a lease between granting the use of fruit versus granting also the use. So again, this would be like renting out a farm and granting merely the use, so they can't take the fruits of the fields. So that those fruits would still belong to the owner, versus just granting the whole thing. And so, for example, like you live on a farm, and you farm it and maintain it, and you grant the fruits, all of the fruits, to the owner. And maybe he gives it to you super cheap or something, because you're doing all the farming, and so you have to pay less for the house. Whereas if you're also getting the fruits of the farm, then you're also getting you're taking on the risk of having to farm it and then also sell those fruits, or feed yourself with them, and so forth. So there is a distinction between a simple lease and a usufructuary lease. Aquinas then goes on to lay out a few other things where you grant a thing not so that it may be used, but still that it might be restored later. And so the first one is something under obligation, which he cites as the pignus, or a security. And so you're not granting it to someone so that they can use it. You're granting it so that eventually you'll get it back after you repay the debt or whatever obligation is associated with it. The other one is a deposit. So, you put something in a deposit and then get it back later. And then the final one was a surety. So someone else who puts up their property for your sake. And so, yeah, he has a clear, like almost systematic way of establishing this. And these are all Roman law contracts. And so the thing that we see here is we see that there's this clear distinction between the sale and the mutuum, because, for example, Father Thomas Divine will merely equate them because there's a transfer of ownership. And he'll say that, a simple sale is merely an intratemporal exchange, whereas a mutuum or loan is an intertemporal change. And the difference there, though, is really specifically how the exchange is going on, because you're granting the thing for the sake of receiving something back, something different back in the simple sale, whereas the mutuum, you're granting the use of something that you might then receive it back later. And so there really is a specific difference there. And one of the things I would point out about the sale versus the mutuum, he's trying to equate those because of a formal similarity. And so that would be kind of like the pushing of a woman. You're trying to equate them based on this physical similarity of, in both cases they're pushing, so they must be specifically the same act. So, but because the act is determined by the end, they may have similar formal similarities, but they're specifically different. Because not all that defines a sale or an exchange is that ownership passes. And you can see this especially in a gift. So no one's claiming that a gift is a sale, even though ownership passes. So then that's the difference between a sale and a mutuum. And so I think, therefore, you have specifically different acts, and so you have specifically different ways of evaluating them. And so so at first you have specifically different acts, so they don't necessarily fall under the same rubric of analysis. So if they were both sales, so for example, if you had, just sales of two different kinds of things, like a sale of, a sale of tomatoes and a sale of, a car, those would still fall under just price because they're both specifically the same sort of thing. So usury can't be merely just price because mutuum is a sale, because it's not. So the other way of analyzing this is to say, okay, well, we can accept that the mutuum and the sale are specifically different acts, but the principle by which they're judged is the same. Now, in a sense, that makes sense. In a sense, that does make sense, because they're both acts of commutative justice. And so they do have a similar principle for judging them. because ultimately the principle of commutative justice is this sort of equality that's established in the exchange. But how that equality is established might be different based on the form of the contract. And so one of the things that I've seen is that one of the arguments, though, that just price and usury are, I guess, formally the same, you might say. So they're the same sort of evaluation, is that in the case of usury, the issue really comes down to substance value and use value. And so like Ernest Van Roy makes this claim, Odd Langhorne makes this claim, Father Michael Cronin makes this claim as well. Ironically, Van Roy will say, no, it has no use value, and therefore usury is evil. Cronin will say, no, it does have use value, therefore you can take usury illicitly. And so the issue comes down to how we parse it out. And the issue with use value is the manner in which it's formulated, because everything can have a use value. It's just what use you're making of it. And so you can think about this in Aquinas' terms of a principal and secondary uses. And so the argument goes that money or goods consumed in use have no use value because by the very act of using them, they're used up, they're gone. And so they only have substance value. Cronin will argue that, well, under modern conditions, investments are possible now, and so there is a use value similar to machinery. And so money is taken on this aspect of capital. So that's kind of the way he takes it. But because you have two uses, I mean, more than one use, I should say, everything has both uses that can consume them and uses that do not consume them. I think typically the way that we define what a thing is based on the primary use we make of it. Because like the primary use of a cup is, as a container to drink fluid out of. Whereas, a paperweight is just a heavy object to hold down papers. But you can use a cup as a paperweight. And so you might consider that to be a secondary use of a cup. But a cup it's an artifact, and so it can have many uses. But its primary end is to be used for drinking. And Aquinas uses the example of shoes. But, you can use, you can pretty much use anything as a paperweight. So that's a use that does not consume them. And there's always uses that you can use to consume things. And so you can use a thing to sell it. So anything that's vendable, saleable, can be consumed in use, which is pretty much all property. But also, maybe you want to make a YouTube video and just destroy something. That would be another use that would consume it. Is just its mere destruction. for the sake of entertainment or something. I remember seeing a thumbnail for a Mr. Beast video where he like destroyed a Lamborghini, and yeah, I guess that's a use for a Lamborghini. So there's not a real sense in which anything does not have some use value, because there's always some way of using anything in a way that does not consume it. So I don't think that works. And it's certainly Aquinas' position as well, because he says, money can be used for security or for display. And so these are secondary uses that don't consume it, and you can rent them. Whereas the shoes example, not only can you wear them, but you can sell them. And that's a use that consumes them. So that also does not work as explaining why there's this difference. And so I think really the difference is, going back to the end and the form of the contract. So the sale, and I think I explained this when I read my essay, but in a sale, you're exchanging one thing for another. And so you have this extrinsic measure of need, which measures all things that enter into exchange, that brings them into equality. And that's how you determine justice. Whereas in the case of a mutuum, you grant something in order that it might be restored back later. And that is a simple act of restitution. And well, what's the equality in an act of restitution? It's exact, or what's the justice in an act of restitution? It's exact equality. And so restoring back the exact same thing that you gave. And in the case of the mutuum, as I would argue, it's returning the thing of the same use, that has the same capacity for use as before. So then that would be the same kind and quality. So yeah, I thinking about in terms of contracts as human acts helps us to differentiate the different sorts of contracts, which establishes that specific difference between a sale and a mutuum. And then going further, we can then acknowledge the way in which justice is differently established in those. Which the justice aspect is what I worked on in my presentation. But I think working out the specific nature based on the end is the next step to kind of clarify that point even further. So, and then this becomes even more valuable when we start to think about, well, what does the usurer really want? Well, he doesn't want the thing restored back itself. He wants it to be some sort of exchange, but he does want the same amount back after the fact, but he wants some sort of profit. And so I think when you look at it in that respect, I think what's happening there is you have the fully asset secured loan, because that is really where the lender is actually exchanging for something and is seeking to make a profit off of it. And so given that end, that it's an exchange where he can generate some sort of profit, is what allows that fully secured loan. So you're basically, if we take the fiducia as a principal example of this, then you see, okay, so this is a sort of conditional sale, the fiducia. And so it is a kind of exchange already from the beginning. And so that property that enters into the fiducia is then used to secure the loan. And so then you have that guarantee of this specific debt, the specific amount of money that you paid for it. And then the sort of rental income, and I need to figure out how to articulate this best, but the borrower is retaining his claim against the collateral. So it's not just a simple sale, it's conditional. And so having that condition and allowing it to act as security on the sale is what allows for the profit, is that as long as that property is being used to secure the debt so that the borrower might recover it at some point, that is what allows that to be, him using it in that way allows him to then, allows the lender to then charge some sort of rent on it, because it's got that two-way street where it's not merely a simple sale, and the difference is that the borrower is retaining his claim to it so that he can repay that debt and recover the property. And so I think that is really, if you want to try to term the loan as some sort of exchange where you can eventually receive the amount you gave back later plus some profit, I think that is the form that it takes, is something like the fully collateralized loan or the fiducia. So I think that is really the value of being able to work this out in terms of human acts and contracts. And one of the things that this is really going to blow apart or break away from is legal positivism, because you've really defined contracts not by the will of the legislator, but by the nature of these acts, what the human being is doing and intending to do, what the end of these acts is. And so naturally the mutuum is not profitable, but you could have, the fiducia could be profitable. So yeah. So those are kind of my thoughts. I'm working on a paper to kind of flesh this all out. And then I have a paper in Paris where I'm going to try to flesh this out in terms of economic value, that the usurious mutuum is a sort of value extraction, whereas other sorts of profitable arrangements or activities are actually adding some sort of value. So, yeah, that's the plan. That's the idea. But yeah, any questions, comments, thoughts, whatever, leave them in the comments. But yeah, thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you later. All right, bye.